Good evening, and welcome to what promises to be an exciting discussion, just the thing to whet your appetite for the presidential debate this evening. My name is David LeBlanc, and I'm a professor of politics and public policy here at the University of Virginia and a faculty fellow at the Miller Center. This evening, I'm delighted to welcome Ilya Somin, professor of law at George Mason School of Law. Ilya studies constitutional law, property law, and democratic theory, and he's written a number of books and law review articles focusing on questions related to the proper, and here I mean both legal and political, role of government in the economy. Some of that work focuses on eminent domain, which is a topic that I'm sure we'll get to at some point this evening. Tonight, however, we want to talk about Professor Somin's latest book, Free to Move, Foot Voting, Migration, and Political Freedom, which was published just this year by Oxford University Press. That book makes an argument about the relationship between free movement or foot voting and democracy. He makes a persuasive argument about the way in which foot voting can enhance freedom within societies, whether we're talking about states, localities, or countries. Before we get to Professor Somin, let me note some logistics. We will be taking questions, and I will do my best to generate discussion in the second half of tonight's session. If you have a question, please type it in the question box. It should say Q&A at the bottom of your screen. I will do my best to incorporate those questions into the question and answer period. Note that whatever you type into the Q&A box will be open for everybody to see, so use your discretion. Without further ado, Ilya Somin, welcome to the Miller Center. You're muted.
Thank you very much for having me. I'd like to particularly thank the Miller Center for organizing this event, the University of Virginia generally, and also David for his excellent moderation and management of the event. I'm very grateful, and I'm always happy to have the opportunity to speak at the University of Virginia. It's a little disappointing that conditions do not enable it to be in person, but I hope and expect that we can get a lot out of this Zoom session as well. I think the topic of my book that I'm going to be talking about is also one that's very timely. That is the ability of people to vote with their feet and how empowering them to do that can enhance political freedom. I'm now going to vote with my virtual feet, so to speak, and attempt to share my screen with you. And hopefully we will be able to do that without too much in the way of logistical difficulties. Let me see if we can find the correct file. Okay, so now we can share it and we can do we can do the slideshow mode from the beginning, and you see now the cover of my book, which was just published by Oxford University Press. It perhaps in some ways is bad timing to have a book about freedom of movement that came out right in the middle of a pandemic and a situation where many of us were in lockdown and unable to move. But my hope is that this sad situation can enable people to appreciate freedom of movement, perhaps even more than it was previously possible to do. So in my book, I start out by discussing how most of us think that ballot box voting is the way that we enhance our ability to choose what government policies we want to live under. The voting at the ballot box is in fact the principal expression of our political freedom. But in the book, I suggest that actually political freedom is better enhanced in many instances by empowering people to vote with their feet. And the way that this can be done is actually in three different modes of foot voting. First, foot voting in a federal system, where you choose where to live based on the government policies that may prevail in a particular state or locality. Secondly, foot voting in the private sector, which is probably less familiar to most people than foot voting in a federal system, but I will explain how it actually has a lot of similarities and can further empower people to vote with their feet. And finally, foot voting through international migration, which of course is the most controversial type of foot voting, but also the kind that I will argue has the greatest benefits. Finally, there are a variety of objections that can be raised against expanding opportunities for foot voting, particularly against international migration. I will go through some of those objections and explain why they're not nearly as powerful as some might imagine them to be. So first things first, I want to start by discussing some crucial advantages of voting with your feet over voting at the ballot box. Most Americans, indeed most people around the world, probably feel that voting at the ballot box is the greatest expression of our political freedom. For example, over the next month, we can vote in the presidential election for Joe Biden or for Donald Trump. And in a sense, thereby, that enables us to help choose the policies that we will live under. Ballot box voting, I think, has some important advantages, but it also has two very serious weaknesses. First, the chance that your vote will actually make a difference is infinitesimally small. In a US presidential election, it's about 1 in 60 million. If you live in a swing state, it might be as high as 1 in 1 million, but that's still extremely low. And the same point applies to other elections, such as at the state or the local level. Your odds might be somewhat higher than in a presidential election, but nonetheless, they're extremely low. In most contexts, we would not say that you have meaningful freedom of choice if you have only a 1 in 60 million or 1 in 1 million chance of affecting the outcome. We wouldn't say you have meaningful freedom of speech if you have only a 1 in 1 million chance of being able to determine what viewpoints you're allowed to express. We wouldn't say that you have meaningful religious freedom if you have only a 1 in 1 million chance of being able to determine what religion you're going to practice or whether you want to practice one at all. And I would say that the same point applies to political freedom as well. You don't have very much in the way of meaningful choice if your only options are to make decisions at the ballot box, where the chance that your vote will make a difference are infinitesimally small. And this leads us to the second major weakness of ballot box voting, which is precisely because your vote has so little chance of making a difference, that gives you very little incentive to acquire relevant information or to think about it in any kind of systematically unbiased way. If you're like most people, you probably spend more time and effort seeking out relevant political information the last time you decided what television set to buy or what smartphone than the last time you decided who to vote for president or for any other political office. That's not because the presidency is less important than your smartphone or that it deals with less significant issues. It's that you knew that when you went out to buy a television set or a smartphone, you knew that that decision would actually make a difference. Whereas when you decide who to vote for in a presidential election or any election, the chance that your vote will make a difference is extraordinarily small, and you therefore act accordingly. And lots of survey data bears this out, including much that I went through in my previous book, Democracy and Political Ignorance, and some discussed in chapter 1 of the present book. Lots of data shows that most voters, both in the US and other countries, know very little about the issues that they're voting on. For example, only about 1/3 of Americans can even name the 3 branches of the federal government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. Most are also often ignorant about particular policy issues, about which government officials are responsible for which problems, and so on. The American Medical Association says that before a doctor can treat you or operate on you, they have to have the patient's informed consent. Decisions by government policies, they too are often matters of life and death, as I think we've all seen during the coronavirus epidemic, and indeed even during normal times. Yet, most of the time, because voters are so poorly informed, most of those policies have little, if anything, in the way of informed consent. Most of the time, democratic government is like a doctor whose ministrations you cannot refuse. And most of the people treated by that doctor, they have very little idea of whether they're being given a remedy that actually works or whether they're getting snake oil. By contrast, foot voting is superior on both of these dimensions. When you decide where to live in a federal system or when you decide to migrate to another country, if you're allowed to make that choice at all, that's a decision that actually has a high likelihood of making a difference. And therefore, you have meaningful freedom of choice. And in addition, you have incentives to be better informed. And in the book and in some of my other work, I go through a lot of evidence which indicates that foot voters are, in fact, better informed than ballot box voters. And they also do a better job of evaluating the information that they learn. So foot voting has important advantages over ballot box voting, both from the standpoint of being a meaningful choice that actually has a high likelihood of making a difference, and from the standpoint of incentivizing people to acquire relevant information and make an informed decision. In the book, I go through several leading theories of political freedom and explain how these two advantages translate into significant advantages in terms of those theories. So I'm not limited to some one theory of political freedom that I just concocted myself or borrowed from somebody else. There are a wide range of mainstream theories on which this maps on very well, theories produced by scholars and political philosophers on left, right, and center. And I'm happy to go through those theories in more detail in the questions. For now, I'd like to press on and begin talking about the specific types of foot voting that are discussed in the book. One of the innovations that I try to make in this book is to bring all three of these types of foot voting in under one common framework, whereas the previous literature tends to look at them in isolation. And I think the most commonly thought of type of foot voting, the one that most people have in mind when they think about voting with your feet, is foot voting in a federal system. That is, for instance, you can choose where to live in respect to a state or a local government based in part on how much you like the government policies that they have. And this has enormous advantages. For example, it offers a much wider range of choice than ballot box voting typically does. In the US, we have 50 states and almost 90,000 local governments. Many of them have a wide range of different kinds of government policies. So you can choose from many different options. And also, often this particularly provides valuable opportunities to the poor and disadvantaged who throughout American history have used interjurisdictional foot voting to seek out better economic opportunities and also often to escape oppressive or unjust local and state policies in the place where they came from. Historical examples include African Americans leaving segregationist states. They include gays and lesbians moving to places which are more tolerant than the ones that they left. In the book, I discussed how in the 19th century, Western states often offered greater equality to women to incentivize them to move there, and there are many other similar examples. In addition, foot voting can work well even if states and localities are not making any special effort to compete for migrants, even if there's just diversity that arises through random chance or because the jurisdictions want to satisfy the people who already live in the jurisdiction. Still, that creates options for foot voting. However, things can be even better if jurisdictions do have incentives to compete. And in the book, I discuss various ways to incentivize beneficial competition, to strengthen it and expand it to more issue areas. Among other things, we can decentralize more issues to the local or the state level, and that will leave more arenas open to this kind of competition. In the book, I also discuss a number of different potential obstacles to foot voting, particularly for the poor. Among the bigger ones that have arisen in the US in recent years are exclusionary zoning, which makes it difficult or impossible to build new housing in response to demand in many parts of the country. If we break down this exclusionary zoning, it will make it possible for hundreds of thousands or even millions of people to move to areas where they would have greater opportunity. And there are also other obstacles, such as restrictive occupational licensing and a number of others that we can also break down and thereby empower more people to vote with their feet in this way. It is already the case that historically the poor and disadvantaged have benefited from this most, but we can still further expand those potential benefits by breaking down the obstacles that still remain and that in some cases have grown greater in recent years. The second type of foot voting that I consider in the book is one that is probably less familiar than foot voting under federalism. That is foot voting in the private sector. And it so happens that both in the US and in many other countries, there are increasingly private organizations that provide goods and services similar to those that are often provided by regional or local governments. The best example is private planned communities, such as homeowners associations, condominiums, and others. Almost 70 million Americans already live in these kinds of private planned communities, and they offer a wide range of freedom of choice. In most places, it's possible to squeeze in many more private planned communities in a given geographic area than local governments, and therefore this offers more choice than foot voting under federalism can. Moreover, often the quality of the services provided by these organizations is often higher than equivalent public services. I discuss some of the evidence for that in the book. Here, I'll just mention one example that's been in the news recently. Many of these organizations have their own security services that protect people against crime. And as a general rule, they're much less likely to abuse their powers, to engage in racist or other harmful behavior than public police are. And if they do screw up, if they do abuse you, they generally don't have qualified immunity that protects them against lawsuits that you might file against them. So this is just one of a number of examples how these things can provide useful competition, both for each other and also for the public sector. The common criticism that is made against these kinds of organizations is that they're really just only for the wealthy. The poor can't afford them. So Robert B. Reich, Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton, famously said, "This is the secession of the successful. It's just rich people wallowing themselves off from the rest of society." I think the available evidence shows this just isn't true. There are not 70 million very rich people in American society. But in the book, I do recognize that this form of organization is often less readily available to the poor than to the middle class or the wealthy. And I have various proposals in the book to enhance its availability to more people. What is true of private planned communities is also true for a variety of other services that the private sector can provide, where there are opportunities to vote with your feet. That includes private school choice, private provision of a variety of services through civil society organizations, and also through the commercial sector. And I discuss some of those examples in the book. It is not my claim that private communities can fully displace the public sector, and it's also not my claim that state or local governments can fully displace the federal government. There are some problems so large scale that perhaps only a state government or even a national government is the only thing that can handle them. But there is much more decentralization possible than we currently have, and there is much we can do to empower people to vote with their feet, both in the private sector and through state and local governments as well. I want to go on next to the most controversial form of foot voting, which is foot voting through international migration. As most of you probably know, this type has become very controversial in public debate, both in the US and in Europe and a number of other places. There has been a right-wing populist backlash against it. It helped bring Donald Trump to power in 2016 and also benefited far-right nationalist politicians in Europe. Nonetheless, despite this political controversy, there are tremendous gains to be had here. The reason why is that the difference in quality between national governments is far greater than any differences that exist within a particular nation. Think of whatever you think is the best American state and compare it to the worst. That's a pretty significant difference, perhaps, but it pales in comparison to the difference between the United States and Mexico, or the United States and Venezuela, or the United States and China, and any number of other countries out there in the world where the government is oppressive, unjust, corrupt, and so forth. Here are just a couple of examples. You have refugees fleeing Cuba, escaping a totalitarian communist state. You have refugees coming from Syria to the United States, escaping a brutal civil war, and also the tyranny of Assad, as well as persecution by radical Islamists like ISIS and others. These people and many others like them, if they're able to foot vote through international migration, they have massive increases in freedom on virtually any conceivable dimension. They have massive increases in their economic welfare. And there are many other examples like this around the world. Think of women fleeing patriarchal societies like Saudi Arabia, for example, religious and ethnic minorities fleeing persecution, poor people fleeing societies where it's virtually impossible for them to rise out of poverty, and so on and so forth. The gains here are so large that they're literally incalculable, at least if you think in terms of human freedom generally. But economists have tried to estimate the purely economic gains, narrowly conceived. And the standard estimate is that if we had free migration throughout the world, we would double the world's GDP. That is, the world would be twice as wealthy as it currently is. Why? Because there are many millions of people currently trapped in places where no matter how smart they are or how hardworking, it's virtually impossible for them to escape poverty. Whereas if those people could move to the US or Western Europe or Canada or other at least relatively freer societies, then they could almost immediately be 2 or 3 times more productive than they currently are. And that's without even accounting for improvements in their skills. So if a Mexican or a Salvadoran crosses into the US, they almost immediately become maybe twice as productive as they were before. And over time, that gap can grow even greater as they improve their skills and further integrate into the society. So the gains here are vast. And I will just further note that there's about 1/3 of the world's population that lives under dictatorships. And for those people, foot voting through international migration is virtually their only hope of exercising any kind of meaningful political choice at all. They don't even have the very limited opportunity of exercising choice at the ballot box that we enjoy in the United States and in other democracies. Despite these enormous gains, there are still many types of objections which are raised against international migration. And as I'll explain a bit later, most of these apply to internal foot voting as well. In the book, I divide these objections into 2 categories. First is a set of arguments which say that governments have a general right to exclude. They don't necessarily have to have a good reason. They can just exclude for almost any reason they want. Then there's a second category which says that maybe there isn't the general right to exclude, but we should be able to exclude people based on potential specific problems they might cause, such as overburdening the welfare state, or perhaps immigrants might come in and vote for bad politicians who will enact bad public policies, or other types of practical objections like this. So I'd like to first start with the set of theories which say that there is a general right to exclude. And the most commonly advanced version of this theory is the kind which said that particular territories are properly under the control of specific racial or ethnic groups. So think, for example, of the poster currently on the screen. This is a poster put up by French nationalists which says, La France aux Français, France for the French. That is, the idea is that France is owned by ethnically French people and they can keep others out. Similarly, you could say Germany for the Germans, Russia for the Russians, Japan for the Japanese, and so on. This theory doesn't translate very well for the United States because if any group has that right in the US, it might be the Native Americans. So if you're a true believer in this theory of ethnic self-determination on behalf of the so-called original owners of a particular area, then you might say the Native Americans should be able to expel everybody else, including probably all or most of us. But even aside from the US example, this theory has many serious weaknesses. I go into them in some detail in the book. Here I'll just highlight one which I think is particularly severe. If you take this idea seriously, it's a justification for racial and ethnic discrimination. Whether you're allowed to live in a given country depends on who your parents were or what racial or ethnic group they belong to. In almost every other context, we reject this sort of discrimination, or at least say there should be a strong presumption against it. We reject South African apartheid, which said particular areas should be reserved for Blacks and others for whites. We reject racial segregation in the United States and similar policies elsewhere, which tried to separate people out based on race or ethnicity. And similarly, we reject racial or ethnic discrimination in most other contexts of government policy because we say that whether you're Black or white, or whether you're Hispanic or Anglo or Chinese as opposed to something else, that's a morally irrelevant characteristic. It's not something that you can control. It's not something that determines how good a person you are. And it's certainly not something that determines how much freedom you're entitled to have. If we accept this idea domestically, it seems to me that this very same point should apply internationally. That if this shouldn't be allowed to constrain your ability to move around within a country or to decide where you want to work or what career you should be able to pursue, the same thing should apply to international migration as well. If we reject racial and ethnic discrimination in one context, the same principle should apply in others. In the United States, as opposed to the racial and ethnic argument, we more often hear an argument for a general right to exclude, which analogizes nations to private houses or to private clubs. So the theory here is that the owner of a house, for example, can exclude people, and he doesn't necessarily have to have a good reason for doing so. He or she can simply say, I don't like this particular person, and I don't want to let them in. Similarly, the members of a private club can refuse admission to new net members, and they don't necessarily have to have a good reason. I'm a Boston Red Sox fan, so I can start my club that's just for other Red Sox fans. I can exclude fans of other baseball teams or people who just don't like baseball or prefer other sports and so forth, not because the fans of other teams or the non-sports fans are necessarily worse people, but just because I don't want them to be in my particular club. And they're here too, as with the ethnic self-determination argument, this theory also has many flaws. And I go through many of them in the book. Here, I will highlight what I think is the single biggest one. And that is that if you take this idea seriously, it has dire implications, not just for immigrants, but also for natives. Think about how the owner of a private house has the right to allow in that house only that speech which he or she agrees with. So I might say in my house, only pro-Republican speech is allowed, or only pro-Democratic speech. Other political viewpoints are forbidden. Similarly, I might say only my preferred religion can be practiced in my house, only Islam or only Judaism or only Christianity. And you can say the same thing about a private club. You can have a Republicans only club, a Democratic club, a Christian club, or a Muslim club, and they exclude everybody else who doesn't share those particular beliefs. So if you hold that a government is like a homeowner or like the head of a private club, then they would have those sorts of powers as well. And that strikes me as a pretty compelling reason to reject these sorts of analogies and instead to suggest that the powers of government should be much more limited than those of private homeowners or private club members. As I said, I go into this in greater detail in the book, but for now, I would like to press on to objections which focus not on a general right to exclude, but on the idea that sometimes we need to be able to exclude people to prevent them from causing negative side effects to society or from causing harm in various ways. And I already mentioned some examples. We might worry that immigrants would overburden the welfare state. They might go on welfare and that causes huge government expenditures. In the extreme case, maybe the government even goes bankrupt. They might come in and vote for harmful government policies. If we have too many of the wrong kinds of immigrants and they start voting for the wrong people, they might even vote in a president who has no regard for liberal democratic values whatsoever, who constantly imagines himself to be like a dictator, who says awful things on Twitter and so forth. I know this scenario is very hard to believe, but at least in principle, it could happen. And in the book, I discuss a wide range of other scenarios that have been raised by different critics about bad things that might potentially happen. I don't claim that such negative effects never occur, and I believe that they should be taken seriously. But before saying that they justify excluding people, I would ask the following three questions. First, we want to ask, how big is this problem really? Because in many instances, it turns out that it's not very big at all, or maybe even non-existent. For example, it turns out that when you look at the data, places that have a lot of immigrants don't actually have more welfare spending per capita than places that have very few. The overwhelming majority of immigrants, even low-skilled ones, are actually net contributors to the fiscal coffers of the United States and other advanced nations. So it turns out this is a non-problem. Similarly, Donald Trump and others have claimed that immigrants are increasing our crime rate in the US. The truth is the opposite. They actually have a much lower crime rate than native-born Americans do. And therefore, when Mexico sends us people, as Trump likes to put it, they're actually reducing our crime rate rather than lowering it. And there are a number of other problems also like this, which are claimed, but when you look at the data, it just doesn't check out. However, in some cases, maybe there really is a problem. And in those situations, I would go to my second question and ask, is there a keyhole solution? That is there a way to address this problem without actually keeping people out? And in many instances, the answer is yes. Let's say that you worry that despite what the data suggests, maybe immigrants will overburden the welfare state after all. In that event, you can simply do more of what we already do, which is to limit their eligibility for certain welfare programs. We already do that under the 1996 Welfare Reform Act. Many European nations have similar policies, but in principle, you could tighten those policies up and limit eligibility even further. Similarly, if you worry that immigrants will vote for the wrong types of politicians and cause harmful government policies, you can again do a keyhole solution which builds on existing policies. We already have a policy that immigrants cannot become citizens unless they have been there for at least 5 years, and unless they pass a civics test that about 2/3 of native-born Americans would fail if they had to take the test without studying. And in principle, you could make the 5-year period longer, you can make the test harder, and so forth. And there are similar keyhole solutions for a wide range of other problems that I go into in the book. But let's say there really is a serious problem and it seems like there's no keyhole solution available. Still, there's a third question you want to ask, and that is, can we tap the vast wealth created by migration in order to alleviate some of the migration's own negative side effects? So for example, let's say you worry that immigrant workers will displace native workers or reduce their wages. I think the data suggests that this problem is overblown, but to the extent that you think it's a real problem and needs to be alleviated, you can tax some of the enormous wealth created by migration and use it to increase wage subsidies to whatever category of native-born workers you think is entitled to it. For example, you can expand the earned income tax credit for them or give them other kinds of subsidies. That way we get the enormous economic and other benefits of migration, but we also help this group that might have suffered a negative side effects so everybody can win. And I have similar tapping the wealth ideas for other potential negative side effects of migration that I go into in the book. I would also mention that these ideas apply very well to the current coronavirus crisis, even though I obviously wrote the book and it was published before the crisis really hit. I think the problem of spreading disease is potentially a real one, though there's differences in the literature about how much international movement and migration really spread it. But to the extent that it's a problem, there's a very good keyhole solution, which has already been adopted by the nation of South Korea. One of the leaders in handling this crisis effectively simply required the migrants to spend 14 days in quarantine upon arrival. That's enough to ensure that either they don't have the disease at all or that they're no longer contagious. And this works much better than excluding people categorically. Among other things, if you exclude them entirely, that creates what we already have, which is a large population of illegal migrants. And those people in turn, if they have symptoms of the disease, they have every incentive not to report for testing, because if they do, they might be subject to deportation. I would add that our immigration detention facilities, which are horrible in many ways and were even before coronavirus, they are of course horrible breeding grounds for the spread of the disease, and they can potentially spread it outside their walls as well as within them. So if we close down the detention centers and instead just have quarantines for people coming from seriously infected regions, it's a keyhole solution that can be a win-win for everybody. And the same thing is true of many other issues which are raised as supposed arguments against migration. The very last point that I would like to make about all of this is that while almost all of these objections that I mentioned are usually raised against international migration, if you apply them seriously and consistently, they would apply just as readily in most cases against internal migration. If you worry that immigrants will overburden the welfare state, the same thing might happen to Americans if they move from a poorer state to a wealthier one. If they might vote for bad politicians, and that's a reason to keep them out. Well, some Texans say if liberal Californians move to Texas, they might vote for bad liberal politicians there. People in some states have higher crime rates than others. So for instance, I live in Virginia, and neighboring West Virginia has a higher crime rate than we do. So they might potentially, quote unquote, send us criminals, to use Donald Trump's terminology, and then our crime rate might go up. And the same thing is true of almost every other objection to migration that I mentioned earlier. So much more can be said, but for now I conclude, and I very much look forward to discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we have a lot to talk about, and I want to make sure that we can bring some of the questions in. I already see two in the question box, but let me start with fundamental assumptions here. Right. So your fundamental assumption underlying the argument, or at least a big assumption here, is your definition of political freedom is the ability to choose government policies that one wishes to live under. And you add, and I think this is important, that freedom requires the ability to make decisive choices. In the book and in your discussion, you talk about the ability of somebody to actually make a decisive choice when there's a million votes being counted. In other words, your vote needs to be efficacious. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not a political theorist, right? This is not what I do. But I'm wondering if this is too narrow a notion of democracy in that it focuses on outcomes and not on processes. And so I was wondering if you could talk about outcomes versus process, especially within the context of the US, for example, a representative democracy where we don't vote directly anyway. We elect people who make decisions for us. So let's start very broad, and then we can kind of drill down a little bit.
Yeah. So I think there's two good questions embedded there. One is outcomes versus processes. The other is this perhaps based on some narrow idiosyncratic view of political freedom that's unique to me. On the first question, I think my argument covers both outcomes and processes. And I would suggest that a process in which you have almost no chance of making a difference is procedurally unfair from the standpoint of that you're essentially powerless and have no freedom. You might still get a result that you like, but of course the same thing might happen under a dictator or a hereditary monarch. The king or the emperor might end up adopting a policy that you like, but you would still say that you had no meaningful freedom in the process if you had no chance of affecting his or her decisions, or if you had only a 1 in a million chance, like the emperor allows you to roll a million-sided dice, and if you come up with a certain number, then he or she will take your advice, but otherwise not. So I think my argument has a process dimension as well as an outcome dimension. I suggest that on both, foot voting is often better than ballot box voting. On the issue of whether this is a narrow or idiosyncratic view, in the book I discuss a number of different theories of political freedom offered by political theorists, most of whom, unlike me, are not libertarians. So left-wing political theorists, moderate ones, some conservative ones. And on all of their models, if you trace it out, it turns out that if you are given a meaningful choice that has a real chance to make a difference, you have more meaningful freedom on their definition of it, not just in my personal definition than you would otherwise. I'll mention one example, the theory of non-domination, which suggests that political freedom means that you're not living under the domination of other people where they control you and you have little or no choice of affecting your fate. Under democracy, you are in fact controlled by the majority of voters, or to the extent that representatives or bureaucrats wield independent power, you're controlled by them, and you're to a large extent dominated by them under the definition of domination used by the non-domination theorists. Whereas on the other hand, if you have opportunity to vote with your feet, the degree to which you're dominated is much, much less. It might not be eliminated entirely, but it's a much lower level of domination. And also in the book, I recognize, of course, that there are theories that particular groups have rights over territories and governments. I criticize the ethnic version of that theory. I mentioned that in the presentation, but there are also non-ethnic versions, such as that offered recently by Sarah Song in an important recent book. She's a professor at Berkeley, and in the book, I offer some criticism of her ideas. So I think in my book, I offer an approach that I think is congruent with a wide range of relatively individualistic theories in the liberal tradition. There are also group theories, but I try to explain why I think those group theories are wrong. Finally, I would add that when we think about every other kind of freedom that we value, we generally would not say, well, 1 in a million chance is enough. A 1 in a million shot at religious freedom, how dare you complain? You've got your religious freedom. All you got to do is persuade 51% of the voters to agree with allowing your particular religious denomination to flourish. Or you have freedom of speech in that situation and so on. In almost every other context, we would say that's not enough. We might even say it's barely anything at all.
So again, I think we can, let me just kind of push on this a little bit. I mean, this notion that process matters. I mean, you've defined process here in relation to the outcome, right? So you said that a process whereby you would have very little impact on a potential outcome is not a situation that is necessarily free, or is not a good example of what we might consider to be a politically free environment. Would it follow, Ilya, that as we move to smaller and smaller and smaller political units, so going from a country, whether it's a federal or not federal system, we'll bracket that for a second, to a state, to a community, to a locality, to a school board, to a fraternity or sorority, that as we get smaller and smaller and smaller, where the probability of you being decisive matters, then you would say that those local units provide the individual with more individual freedom, more political freedom?
Controlling for other variables, yes,
Of course.
absolutely. But I would resist the notion that this is purely about outcome rather than process. And I think usually when we talk about outcome, what we mean is the quality of the outcome. Was a good or just policy enacted, or was it a policy that benefited you in a particular way? Here, I'm talking about the procedural aspect of how much leverage you have over the outcome. And you might have a lot of leverage, but you might make a bad choice, as that risk exists in almost any decision that you might take. I also argue in the book that because of the incentives of knowledge and because of other structural factors, you generally do get better outcomes with foot voting in terms of the quality of the outcome, but the procedural aspect matters. I think the example of the benevolent dictator, which I mentioned in the book, is a good example that the dictator may be genuinely trying to serve the interests of the people, may try to adopt as good policies as he or she can. Nonetheless, from a procedural point of view, we would say those people have little, if any, political freedom, precisely because they have almost no chance of making a difference. And that's also true for the average voter in a democratic society, that person has only a slightly greater chance of making a difference than they do under the dictator. Indeed, with a slight tweak, you can make it exactly the same as with the dictator. The dictator every year can roll a million-sided dice, and if your number comes up, then you get to be the person for that year who has influence over policy. And in that event, you would say you have the exact same likelihood of having influence as you do in a democratic election with a similar number of people. It is true that sort of the smaller the group, the more your chance of making a difference, but you have to get to very, very low numbers indeed before you have anything like the same chance of making a difference in an electoral process as you do by voting with your feet. And units that small, with just a handful of people, they might just not be able to provide many of the kinds of services and opportunities that people reasonably want.
So you embedded in that answer, and again, I think very well articulated in the book is the importance of information, right? And I think one of the parts of the volume that I find most persuasive is the importance of foot voting, especially in an environment where voters have limited information. But I want to ask, this notion of rational ignorance. Right. So we have voters that are rationally ignorant, who choose to take cues from the media, from political elites, et cetera. If I voluntarily decide that I'm going to collect less information, and I do that of my own free will, right? Am I, according to your definition, do I have less freedom than somebody who goes out and collects all relevant information before making a political decision?
In one sense you do, and in another sense you don't. In one sense, those two individuals have exactly the same amount of political freedom because they both only have one vote out of many millions, setting aside for a moment the possibility of engaging in other kinds of participation, like being a pundit or a political activist, which I do talk about in the book. But in another sense, the ignorant voter is in a bad position if you believe in any kind of theory of informed consent. Moreover, while in a certain sense, the reason why they're not informed is just through their own choices, in another sense, it's because of the bad structural incentives that they're faced with. So you might, just as we talk about institutional racism, we can also talk about institutional ignorance, a term that perhaps I should have used in the book, that the ignorance that we see in democratic society about political issues is to a large extent institutional, that because of the incentives that are created for the public, and also because of the size and complexity of modern government, which makes it very difficult to inform yourself about all the different ways that different government officials act and can affect your fate. So I think that you can argue about the extent to which individual voters deserve blame for being ignorant, and that's the subject of a number of other excellent works by other scholars. But and I think they do deserve some blame. But however much blame you think they should get, the fact remains that a system where most voters have strong incentives to remain ignorant and do in fact remain ignorant is one where the quality of their freedom of choice is significantly diminished, not just on my idiosyncratic view, but from the standpoint of many of these leading theories of political freedom that I talk about. And indeed, some of them actually would want voters to be even more informed than I perhaps would say is necessary.
Yeah. So I mean, I hear where you're coming from, right? But it takes a lot of time, energy, effort, and potentially information in order to decide. If I'm a voter, well, I am a voter, right? And to decide who I'm going to take my cues from, right? So, for example, I might not have been persuaded when The Rock decided that he was going to endorse Joe Biden 2 days ago, but I put all my chips in when Bruce Springsteen comes out in favor of Biden, because I think that Springsteen has better information than The Rock does. In that way, I'm casting judgment on the relative efficacy of the person that I'm taking cues from, right? So in that regard, I guess I'm somewhat informed about their preferences and their priors and the amount of information that they have. So can't they act as a substitute in a sense?
Yeah, so both in this book and even more so in my previous book, Democracy and Political Ignorance, I discuss a variety of theories which say, well, actually, voter ignorance isn't that big a problem, because even if the voters are ignorant, they can use various kinds of information shortcuts to make up for it. And the one that you posit is known as the opinion leader shortcut. So I might not know much about politics, but I trust Bruce Springsteen. I'll just vote for whoever he says to vote for. I think in and of itself, this could potentially work, but there are a couple of problems. One is you have to have some base level of knowledge to know which opinion leader to choose. You have to be able to judge, how well informed is Springsteen really? Does he have good values and so forth? It turns out that the data indicates that most people don't have that necessary pre-existing knowledge. And in addition, to choose opinion leaders well, you have to have an incentive to choose them based on the truth value of the things that they say. So not based on how entertaining they are or how much they reinforce your pre-existing views. And if you look at the opinion leaders out there who are actually popular, they don't tend to be people who became major opinion leaders because they're deeply knowledgeable about public policy or make good predictions about the effects of government policies. It's because they're people like the ones that you mentioned who are entertaining and popular, or they reinforce people's pre-existing views, or some combination of both. Whereas when people vote with their feet, they have much stronger incentives to acquire at least a baseline level of knowledge that enables them to choose opinion leaders and other information sources more intelligently, and they have some incentive to evaluate the information in a more objective way. I discussed this in more detail in my previous book, but it's also summarized in chapter 1 of this book.
Yeah, so let's hit that, and then I'm going to want to make sure I can take some questions. So I think that point is exactly where I want to go. So we know, and you mentioned this in the chapter on migration, but we also know this from the broad literature on migration, that one of the most important determinants of a location choice on the part of a migrant, so somebody who's leaving Venezuela as a result of, regardless of the reason they're leaving Venezuela, right? The best guess as to where that individual is going to go is where they have friends and family, right? So if we look at the history of migration, we know that Eastern Europeans came to New York and moved where there were other clusters of Eastern Europeans. So they took their cues from others, right? They took their cues from others who had made that journey. Do you consider the idea that I'm going to look and see where my countrymen have gone and follow them to be a different level or sort of information than me deciding that I'm just going to vote the way that Bruce Springsteen is voting?
Yeah, it's vastly better, because it's not just a matter of I'm a Venezuelan and I know there are some Venezuelans living in Florida, so I'll go there too. In most cases, it's I'm a Venezuelan and I know that there are Venezuelans living in Florida, very much like me, who have had vastly greater freedom and opportunity as a result, and are therefore vastly better off than they would have been had they stayed in Venezuela. And that's much more powerful than Bruce Springsteen endorses Biden or whoever he chooses to endorse. And then you still have to ask yourself, well, how do we really know that Bruce Springsteen knows what he's talking about there? On the other hand, if a Venezuelan similar to you, and not just one, but many, have previously moved to the US and have previously done extremely well, that's actually pretty compelling evidence that the same thing might be true for you. I would add also that doesn't necessarily mean that people only go to places where there are other people from the same group. Obviously, some people are going to be the first, the pioneers, so to speak. And if we allow freedom of movement to many different countries, not just one, then you can expect that there might be immigrant communities of Venezuelans in the US, but also in Canada and a number of other countries that are freer and more prosperous than Venezuela is. You already actually have this to some extent. Last time I was in Canada, I saw some of the same types of immigrant communities that were in the US, and the members of those communities, they sometimes had good reasons why they chose Toronto over New York City or whatnot. Yeah. So I think definitely the Venezuelan who looks at the experiences of other Venezuelan immigrants and depending on that, chooses where to live. On the whole, they're engaging in a much better and more likely to be accurate decision-making procedure than the person who looks at Springsteen or Rush Limbaugh or some other celebrity and says, well, if that guy endorses Biden or that guy endorses Trump, then that must mean that Trump is who should be president.
No, and again, I think the point, as you make in the book, is given the consequence of foot voting, there's going to be greater investment in obtaining information. Let me shift gears a little bit. Again, we have about 10 minutes left. So this notion of foot voting is really compelling, and in lots of cases in the book and in your description, the notion here is that foot voting occurs voluntarily. That I am dissatisfied with my ability to influence policies around me, and so I'm going to vote with my feet. Jack Roberts asks a question that I think is really interesting and really relevant to this discussion. When we think about foot voting in some cases, and especially in the context of climate change, whether we're talking about individuals leaving Houston after Katrina, or people leaving Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl, or the waves of climate migration that we're seeing today, is this foot voting, and Jack's question is this foot voting if the motivation is physical safety and comfort and economic opportunity rather than a political choice? Might the nature of why and how somebody is actually forced to leave because their home is underwater, might that blur or obscure political choices and the political implications for your argument?
So it's a good question. It's actually one I address in the book in two different ways. One is physical safety and comfort, including environmental policy, are actually heavily affected by government policy. Some governments do a better job than others of constraining crime, of dealing with pollution, and all of the other kinds of issues you just mentioned. So choices that in some sense can seem to be economic actually have a political dimension. If you reject that, then you would have to conclude that a lot of ballot box voting also is not really political, because of course the biggest determinant of many elections is how is the economy doing, and environmental policy can also have an impact on elections. A second dimension in which I address, you could say, well, it's not really voluntary if you're being driven by some kind of horrible oppression or disaster, whether it be a natural disaster or whether it be oppression in the country of origin. I would say it's still much better than being trapped where you are. You still have a greater degree of freedom than if you're trapped. In addition, if you have freedom of movement to many different jurisdictions, you at least do have a meaningful choice about which of the other options that you choose. So it's not either A or B, with A being practically a non-starter because you're suffering horrible disaster there. It's A versus B, C, D, and E, and so forth. Finally, I have a section in the book on how the greater wealth created by free migration can actually enable us to address environmental problems, including climate change, better than we currently do. One of the best established relationships in the social sciences is that wealthier societies also have lower pollution and have an easier job of dealing with climate change and other problems of that sort.
Yeah, again, we can go into that, and we can spend a long time on that. I find that evidence fairly compelling as well. Another question, Lauren Hershey asks a question asking about undocumented migrants, and is really interested in the issue having to do with the potential availability of temporary work permits. And so I wanted to take her question and kind of add on to it, and raise the question of the notion of migration. And again, I find the evidence or the arguments about the $1 trillion bills left on the sidewalk extremely compelling. Does it require, when we open the borders, in your view, right? Does that also require an opening up of citizenship, of political rights, or does that just require an opening up of labor markets?
So it most definitely requires the latter, and also, of course, of housing markets as well. It requires a right of residency, a right to work. To get the economic benefits, that is by far the most important thing. But with respect to citizenship, much depends on what rights you think should be attached to it. To my mind, to make a long story short, I would either want to decouple from citizenship these rights of residency and work and things like freedom of speech and religion and the like, or I would want to make citizenship less dependent on parentage and place of birth, these morally arbitrary circumstances, or ideally some combination of both. But I do recognize, as I've already hinted at earlier in the presentation, that voting rights in some respects are a different thing from freedom of movement and freedom to work, and that voting rights do imply the power to rule over other people, or at least to participate in a small way in doing so. And so we already have eligibility rules for voting that, for instance, exclude children, in some cases, some categories, the mentally ill. Many states exclude at least some felons and so forth. So in principle, if a sufficiently grave threat is posed by certain categories of people, if they're allowed to vote, if they'll vote in fascism or communism or something else horrible, then that might be a justification for restricting the right to vote. Though I should emphasize, particularly in the US, if you look at the differences in political views between immigrants and natives, they actually aren't that great. And they become smaller in the second and third generation. And to the extent that they are bigger, it's in part because we have one party that in recent years has become the anti-immigrant party. So of course, if you promote hatred and hostility to this group of people, they're not going to like your party. On the other hand, in periods as recent as the administration of George W. Bush, both when he was governor of Texas and when he was president of the US, there wasn't nearly as much difference in terms of partisanship between immigrant and native voting. So if you just have two parties, neither of which try to set themselves up as the anti-immigrant party, then that will further reduce any such skew.
Does your argument suggest, I know the answer to this, but I want to hear how you think about this. This notion of voting bound to territoriality. So the idea of being able to vote where you live and maybe also being able to vote where you are a citizen. So given your argument, if we open the borders and we allow people to move from place to place, should the right to vote be limited to where they are currently living? Or can they vote in a place where they might still be a citizen if we allow for dual citizenship?
So that's a good question, but it's also an issue that arises under the status quo. We already have millions of Americans who live abroad, and if they're citizens, they have the right to vote. The same thing is true in countries like Canada and elsewhere. So I don't have a strong view on this question of to what extent should voting rights follow territoriality once territorial residency is no longer dependent in the way it currently is on who your parents are and who you were born. There would be a separate set of questions, as to some extent there already is, of if you haven't lived in an area for the last 20 years or whatnot, should you still be allowed to vote there? Maybe you would want to have a test of what connections you have there, or maybe you don't even need that test because an American who has lived abroad for 20 years but still takes the trouble to vote in America, that's some indication by itself that they have some ties to the US. Otherwise, why would you bother? And similarly, if they have dual citizenship, I'm not sure that it's somehow terrible if they vote in the US, but also vote in Canada. There are a good many people who already have the right to do things like this. There are, I think, about 1 million Canadian citizens resident in the US, many of whom are dual citizens, and a good many Americans resident in Canada who can vote in both countries. And I've yet to see anything horrible come about as a result of it.
Terrific. Well, on that note, let's wrap up. And if everybody was here, we would say please join me in thanking our speaker, Ilya Somin, for an engaging conversation. Thank the Miller Center team for putting this together, and we look forward to seeing, or at least having those of you in the audience part of our future events. They're listed at millercenter.org. Thank you, Ilya. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, just a quick note, and students in my migration class, we will see you at 6:15.
Can you send me again the Zoom link for that?
I will. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you.